Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, which is the first of a series of webinars entitled AI Talks at ETUI. My name is Aida Ponce del Castillo, and I will be your host. Today, we will discuss the machine learning pipeline and its space for action. For that, we have our special guests from AlgorithmWatch, a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that is committed to watch, unpack, and analyze automated decision-making systems and their impact on society. We have Mollen. Anne is a senior policy and advocacy manager at AlgorithmWatch. She studied communication and political sciences and worked in several research projects on the interrelation between digital media, society, and democracy. At AlgorithmWatch, Anne works on automated decision-making systems in the area of labor, online platform, and the sustainability of AI. Lukas Hondrich is also from AlgorithmWatch, is currently working on a project on labor rights and AI regulation in the EU, where he investigates how workers and unions can co-govern data-driven socio-technical systems in the context of the proposed AI Act. Before joining AlgorithmWatch, Lukas engineered machine learning systems in the e-commerce and the tech industry. He holds a master's degree in cognitive science, neuroscience from TU Dresden, and a bachelor degree in psychology from JGU Mainz. So let's start our question, and I will first turn to Anne with two basic but very essential questions. Anne, what is AI and what is machine learning?
Well, it's a complicated question and I don't have an easy answer to it because we actually try to avoid the term artificial intelligence because we think it is contributing to the opaqueness that we want to kind of avoid and circumvent and surpass, because we'd rather speak about automated decision-making systems. And by that, we mean rule-based algorithms, so basic automations based on rules, a rule-based algorithm. But we're also talking about machine learning systems, and that can include neural networks or deep learning. So we much rather talk about ADM systems because we think it is essential to have a clear understanding of what we are talking about when we are trying to influence and advocate for our interest when it comes to AI. Because AI systems and even machine learning systems are not mimicking human intelligence. They are designed for very, very specific tasks, and there are no way doing what human intelligence is doing. So we try to avoid the term completely because it doesn't help in our work. It kind of hinders of what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, very interesting, because we have a very interesting regulatory definition on the AI Act, which complicates this narrative, what you're talking about. And I'm looking forward what's going to come out from that regulatory definition in the coming months. But let's move on to algorithmic transparency. It seems to be very important. Could you explain to the audience what it is, and why is such a crucial dimension for automated decision-making systems?
Yes, well, there's often the perception that algorithms are a black box and we cannot gain any insight into how an algorithm works. So we have no insight into the procedure. So the concept of algorithmic transparency is a way of gaining more insight, because we might not, in a machine learning system, we might not know how a system reaches its decisions, but we still can gain a lot of insight, for example, on, when we're talking about a rule-based algorithm, what kind of rules are being used to generate the output that the system is generating. Or for machine learning systems, we might not know how a decision is reached, but we might have info about the data that is being put into the system or the training data used. And we can use tests to find out about the level of fairness of a system. So there are ways of providing insights on algorithms and machine learning systems. And it's just a way to ensure that we have some sort of feeling of control over the systems that are being used. But also when we're talking about algorithmic transparency, we need to talk about to whom are we giving that transparency? Is it to the people affected? Is it to policymakers? Is it to watchdog organizations? Is it to the employers maybe implementing these systems? So algorithmic transparency is a good concept, but there are a lot of follow-up questions that need to be answered in order to, you know, make sure it's effective. And also what's crucial is that we also come to accountability. Transparency is not sufficient. It's good to have transparency, but if we have transparency about a really, really bad system, it's still not good. So we need to go further than transparency, but it is a necessary first step.
Thank you, Anne. And just very quickly, really, what's your opinion about the transparency measures or obligations that the Commission is proposing in the AI Act?
Well, we are asking for a lot more extensive transparency requirements, because also the requirements are only on the provider part and not on the user part. So what we think is essential is that systems cannot be viewed isolated from the context of their use, because a lot of the impacts are only starting to become clear once they are in use. So we are actually asking for a lot more obligations and transparency requirements on the user side. This will be necessary as an accountability measurement or tool.
Thank you for that clarification. Shall we move to the most technical part of this webinar? Yes, and for that, let's ask Lukas to join us. And Lukas, you have been working a lot on machine learning from an engineering point of view. Can you explain to the audience what is the machine learning pipeline?
Yeah, so basically the goal is to have a concept that allows a bit more like technical insights and taking apart the different steps and components of a machine learning system or automated decision-making system or AI system, however you want to call it. And so that you are able then to understand and analyze these components better and understand which kind of decisions come with these parts and how these decisions influence different interests of all kinds of different stakeholders. So that then you are able also to design them and specify them in a way that preserves also interests, for example, of workers and employees. Okay, so just very quickly, who are the variety of stakeholders, if you could specify it? Right now, the stakeholders that are basically making all the decisions are representing different aspects of the business, I would say, most of the time. So for example, the management or the product team, thinking more about what kind of product they need or they want, controlling team, paying attention to the costs, and of course the engineering team, bringing the technical requirements and also technical feasibility into the discussion. But of course, stakeholders are, I think, also users and people generally that are affected by these systems. And of course, we think that these people should also have a say in the design and specification of these systems. Great. And in what way do you think that they can have a say? What can they do, practically speaking? I mean, this is a complicated question, like how this gets realized, right? How they can really have a say. That is, I think, an open question, how to best design the co-governance or preservation of their interests. But I think it's just important to note that it's possible technically to design these systems in a way that preserves their interest. And yeah, I think it's important to just be aware of the technical possibility that it's possible.
Are you working on a specific proposal, or can you show us something on the screen probably?
Yeah, maybe we can...
I mean, later I will go a bit into more detail, but we are also working on trying to like summarize all what we think, how exactly this can work. But yeah, we plan to publish something in that direction in the next in the coming weeks or so.
I think if we start our presentation, we have some clarification. So Lukas, I think it might be a good idea to share the screen because we have a presentation prepared. Yes, just to just for you to know. So first, I'm going to be presenting a bit of context information, and then Lukas is going to share a lot more insights also on the technicalities of the machine learning pipeline and where we see space for action for worker representatives and worker voices. So first of all, Aida already mentioned AlgorithmWatch. So we are a research and advocacy organization, and we are indeed, as she said, analyzing the impact of ADM systems, so automated decision-making systems, on individuals and society. And our work is basically focusing on 4 pillars, and work is one of them. So the use of ADM systems in the world of work, but we're also looking at sustainability of ADM systems used in the public sector, and of ADM systems in the public sphere. So basically everything that relates to platform governance and social media. So as we already mentioned, there are a lot of names for what we are focusing on. It could be algorithms, automation, artificial intelligence. And as we said, we like to stick to the name ADM, automated decision-making and automated decision-making systems, because they very clearly define what we are looking at. And you can even further define it. We're looking at rule-based algorithms, at machine learning, at deep learning, and you know, it can be part of machine learning and neural networks. So this is our focus. Oh, sorry, I can't put on the next slide, Lukas, that's your... Yes, so if we focus on ADM in a work context, we can see that there is a very broad debate has emerged in recent years. So of course, there's the whole debate about platform governance, about algorithmic management of platform workers. This has been a huge debate and quite fairly established. And we've also seen quite good responses to algorithmic management in platform work. We also have, you know, the traditional big tech companies like Amazon investing in workplace surveillance and workplace algorithmic management and monitoring of their employees. And, you know, they have been active for quite some time, so that has been an established debate. Also, especially, of course, during the pandemic, as you all know, we have seen an increase in workplace surveillance and workforce management systems that are using automation in what we are calling and others are calling people analytics. So there is a growing tendency in the diversification of ADM in a work context. It has many facets, and you know, we also need to come to more nuanced responses to this, you know, whole broad range of how ADM systems can be used in a work context. And on the other side, I have, I'm showing you some first preliminary results from a study that we conducted on behalf of ITUC at the end of last year. Now we have to actually go back, sorry, Lukas. There we have looked at how our labor organizations are responding, what kind of activities are they engaging in when it comes to algorithmic transparency and accountability when ADM systems are being used in a work context. And what we take from the analysis, I don't want you to see all the details, I just wanted to give you, you know, a brief overview. We have the discussions and the activities remain on a very abstract level. So we have a lot of activities focusing very generally on automation, algorithms, ADM, or artificial intelligence. We have a lot of activities looking at the future of work. We have a lot of abstract fears about job loss and dequalification. And I'm not saying that these, concerns, these things are not relevant, but we have had this discussion for a very long time now, and we feel like it needs to, we need to move forward a little bit. So going to the next slide, this also relates to the study that we did. You can see it here. So these are the results only from Europe on what kind of contributions labor organizations have been providing in relation to algorithmic transparency and accountability. And you can see that the highest percentage is in the fields of analysis, diagnosis, knowledge gathering, scenario sketching, and a lot about strategy, roadmap, and principles. So that would mean how should we be dealing with automation in the future? What kind of principles should we, formulate? Along what principles should automation be implemented in the workplace? And it's good. We have done it ourselves as an organization. We have formulated principles, but it is now the time to move beyond formulating principles and to come more to an implementation of these principles in real life. And so this is really, we kind of want to turn this graph upside down, that we have more capacity building, more empowerment, more training, more union organizing, etc., in concrete cases. So really moving from almost often philosophical discussions to advocating. And I think this is a very important take that we have to take from this analysis. And then moving to the next slide, Lukas, please. Then we are confronted with this fear that ADM systems necessarily have to remain black boxes. And of course, there are a lot of problems. There is a lack of transparency. We might not be getting all the information that we need. And then there is the fear that when we are confronted with machine learning systems, there is also this sort of unsupervised learning where we simply, the fear is, have no control because the system is constantly changing itself, and we have no idea of how we can implement our interest in this constantly changing system, and this system where we have no idea how it reaches any decisions. But we want to kind of, take a step back, and this relates to this idea of demystifying the term artificial intelligence, and also demystifying this sort of abstract fear that if we look at the system, these are technical systems and they operate in certain ways. And there are ways to find entry points for worker advocacy that move from the abstract philosophical level to concrete entry points for, workers being able to advocate for their interests. And I think the machine learning pipeline might be a tool to actually do this. And to demonstrate how it might work, I'm handing over to Lukas, who is the technical expert and who will guide you through the whole machine learning pipeline now.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I mean, I already said the goal behind the concept is to understand and analyze ADMs better. And also being able to configure them in a way that preserves interest. Like, that's the general goal. Yeah, the target was also to have like a framework that fits to all kinds of machine learning systems. So everything from chatbots to like recommendation engines to people analytics systems. We wanted to cover everything, and that of course requires some like a kind of generic framework, but yeah, and this of course like a kind of a challenge to then still have a framework that can be applied and be useful really in every case. Yeah, and basically it's just a series of steps that are taken during the development process of these systems, and then also during maintenance while the system is running, basically. So yeah, the assumption should be that this covers the whole life cycle of a machine learning system. And yeah, I already said also that this is basically also the level where right now decisions are being made, how to balance different business interests, for example, like when business trying to develop these systems and come up with project proposals. This is basically, in my experience, the technical level where the different aspects of interest are coming together. And of course, this is also where we think that this could be a good point to insert also employees' interest into the discussion. Yeah, so now going forward, I will quickly go through the separate steps with a generic classical example, and then go more into detail and zoom in into the different components and steps, and say something to what kind of things are usually done there, and how like risks can be mapped to these steps, and also what kind of safeguards can be brought up to prevent these risks. All right, so a fictional example, very classical use case, for example, would be that a company wants to decrease the cost of finding good employees. For example, they could come up with the idea to develop like a CV screening tool that that makes it really easy to screen like thousands of CVs and basically score them or rank them in a way. And to do that, they might say, okay, we already have like a workforce. Let's try to leverage that data. We know maybe we have an assumption on how successful each employee is. We have lots of data on them, like how their CV and how they communicate and so on. Let's try to use that data. And once they have collected that data, they might use a machine learning model to basically extract the useful patterns, whatever that is. For example, maybe some personality characteristics of the employees to basically predict if an employee will be, I don't know, successful hire or not. And then they have that model and they deploy it and integrate this into a automated decision-making system, which is, I don't know, then just like a classical software system, which has as one component this machine learned model. And then this system can be used, for example, to take an input, for example, a CV, and output a score. And then the system is running, and to maintain it, you could, for example, use the data the model is generating while it's running, and use this data to retrain the model in a certain frequency. So yeah, like that would be like a classical example. And of course, there have been like some problems arising, and the people like familiar with the topic will know that there's like lots of problems actually involved in this kind of project, which I just sketched out. So now I will get a bit more into detail and talk about which problems, for example, that can be mapped to these components. So yeah, starting out with problem definition, I think this could be like the most critical part actually of the whole machine learning pipeline. And still some people wouldn't even consider it to be part of the machine learning pipeline because it doesn't directly involve like programming or mathematics so much. Yeah, however, it's super critical, I think, and it's really worthwhile to pay lots of attention here, because yeah, you define the core business problem that you want to solve and the main approach. And yeah, and also what kind of requirement, like technical requirements the system will have, what kind of scope. Do you want to, for example, automate the whole decision pipeline, or just like a small part and then have a human in the loop or so? And you also define what kind of resources you want to invest, like computational resources, but also human resources. And of course, a big problem here is that it depends heavily on the subjective worldview of the people involved at this stage. For example, if you go back to the CV screening example, there have been some cases, for example, with a system from Amazon, where they did basically that, and they didn't consider the problem that the current workforce they are having is basically or the culture basically is permeated also by harmful biases and sexist and racist hiring patterns. And of course, they basically reinforce and perpetuate these biases if they build a system based on this data. And yeah, people familiar with this topic probably could have warned them, but apparently the people in charge of designing these systems were not aware that these problems exist, or it was not really like a high priority to them. Yeah, so another problem you might run into is that you basically start out with just trying to understand a problem. For example, like what are some key success factors for our employees? And once you have that, you might also want to use that to then act and prescribe basically actions, which is like a big statistical pitfall, because while it might be sufficient for a descriptive model to rely on like correlations, if you want to act on that, you would need, or you're basically relying on your model to be like causally valid also, and to have like a causally accurate model of the world. Otherwise, you just rely on like correlation, and then that can cause like these things where you just hire men, for example, because like all your engineering team were men, something like this. Yeah, another general problem here would be that these systems also tend to restructure like organizational processes in such a way that they tend to concentrate power. And this alone may be like disadvantages for the long-term power relationships and for the power of employees they're having in like negotiations. Yeah, and another problem is also that, or like a common failure mode is basically that people try to optimize artificial scarcity instead of alleviating the scarcity. Like this is really seen often in the healthcare sector, where they try to optimize like some medical resources instead of basically trying to alleviate this scarcity in the first place. And if you do that, like this tech solutionism, that can also basically be counterproductive and lead to an like yeah, to make the problems worse and entrench these problems. So yeah, talking about safeguards, it's of course really dependent on the on the use case and the specific scenario. However, one thing that is certainly important is that employees' interests are represented in this stage also and integrated, and especially that also marginalized groups within the employees are represented. But this might not be like in itself like sufficient to basically safeguard against all problems, but I think it's a necessary precondition. All right, moving on to data. So this step basically concerns like the data collection and data processing, and it basically involves like it means capturing the parts, aspects of the world which are considered to be relevant for your business problem and putting them into data. So that means here basic things have to get defined, like what is a worker, and I don't know, what kind of attributes do they have, like and what kind of interconnections between these entities exist. And of course, this involves like lots of measuring and transforming data and so on. And it's important to keep in mind that all these things are really geared towards the business interests and measuring the business interests and objectives. So common risks that appear here are that these decisions and simplifications are quite arbitrary and don't necessarily concern the interests of employees. For example, you might in the CV screening scenario, you might the psychological constructs might be just geared towards, I don't know, like performance factors, but not so much about like interpersonal relationships, which are maybe more important to the well-being of employees, or just as an example. Also, what can happen here easily are privacy violations. Yeah, now, especially during the last 2 years, more and more of the work happens digitally. And especially if you use like work platforms like Slack or Windows 365, lots of data is actually collected, and then it's very easy to use that data, even though it might be illegal actually. And I think it's quite realistic that companies don't really know and what is legal and what is illegal, and yeah, also might not care so much, of course. Yeah, and of course, this is also an important topic, is that all these data sources or all this data might be biased, and people might be unfair represented in the data, because again, of course, this the work culture and society is permeated by these harmful biases, and so they will also be reflected in the data the company gathers. So safeguards are here, and maybe space for acting on behalf of employees' interests are that you really be at least aware of these biases and try to de-bias these data sets as well as possible. Of course, that's not really 100% possible, but to a certain degree, it really is. And of course, it costs like time and resources to do that, but it's important to know that there are these possibilities, and it's worthwhile to invest here. Also, it is important to think of the interest employees have within a certain project. For example, they might want to have a system that treats like people the same, irrespective of like sensitive attributes. and that outcomes are like equally distributed. If you have like a positive outcome, for example, like hiring or promotion, that that this is like equally distributed among like sex, race, and gender, and so on. However, that means that you also need to have to collect the data to be able to actually measure these interests and outcomes. For example, you would need to collect data on the ethnicity of people, or the gender of people. And of course, here you can also see that oftentimes the design also involves making some kind of difficult trade-offs, maybe, because yeah, you also have to give up some very private information, right, to be able to have a system that then is fair, or to have a system that is provably fair.
Lukas, before we move on
Yeah.
to the next step of the pipeline, I would like to pick up a couple of questions that just emerged in the chat that are very close to what you just presented. The first one, probably linked to what issues about privacy and data protection. There is a question from Hondrich who says that could we possibly use GDPR as a tool to get insights, or as a tool to get more data protection and privacy at the workplace? And also, and the second question that I would like you to address is, what do you mean by power shifts? Can you please clarify that to the audience? Go ahead, Lukas.
Okay, so I will start out with power shifts, because I'm not an expert on privacy and GDPR and so on. With power shifts, I mean that basically these systems tend to restructure lots of the processes in an organization, and that itself might lead to, for example, before maybe workers' councils had some right of having a voice, like who to hire, or how to for which rules you use in hiring. And afterwards, there will be just like one centralized system that will be in place, like in every country or in every place. So they will basically lose power here, and also lose knowledge about how everything works in consequence. Yeah, and for the GDPR question, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I know that the GDPR, I think, prohibits, for example, the collection of data of sensitive attributes. But I think the AI Act plans to allow that specifically. Anna, maybe you want to?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in because it is a very complex question, and we have some safeguards in the GDPR. We have I can't remember the article, the precise article, but we have
Article 88.
No, I meant the other one, the one on automation.
Article 22.
Yeah, 22, exactly, 22. I knew it was before the 80. Exactly. So we have the article saying that we have the right to be not subjected to a solely automated decision. So we have that right. And then we have worker-specific rights in Article 88, as Aida said. We have to say that we as AlgorithmWatch, we are not the legal experts. We have conducted a legal analysis for Germany because you have in Article 88, it spells out that there can be more specific national legislations. So what we have done is we have looked at the case of Germany with a legal expert, but it is such a complex field. And we would so wish to gain more insight. And actually, we're currently working on gaining insight on more European countries to be able to better answer that question. But it is a very complex field. And so for the time being, we can't really provide a better answer than that we have certain safeguards. They are probably not addressed adequately or used adequately for the time being. But this is something that when we're talking about, going from these philosophical guidelines and principles to more concrete steps, this will be part of it. We need more legal analysis, and we as an organization, but also I think in the broader field, we need more legal analysis of what is possible, and also how the AI might feed in, or what is missing, where there are gaps and where there are simply areas that are not regulated sufficiently for the time being.
Right. So yes, you are correct. But if I may add, my point of view is that all of the principles of GDPR apply to the context of employment because Article 88 says so. Now, that's the theory, which I really think it's fantastic. The practice, it's another aspect that, and of course, we need to know how to use GDPR to know whether it is applicable or not in the context of employment. But I see that this is a very hot topic, and I suggest that we do another webinar on how to apply GDPR in the context of employment. And we carry on with the model training to continue with knowing about the ML pipeline. Continue, please, Lukas. Thank you.
All right. Let's move on to model training. So now we have the collected data that we need. And in the model training phase, we basically try to extract all the useful patterns that are in that in this data, right? And this is like a very experimental and iterative process, basically, where you try to tweak the data that you use to train your model, the algorithm itself, and also the validation procedure you use, basically to try to stay true to your business objective. So the problem here is, of course, that there's not a magic silver bullet to basically know for the model, for the algorithm, which patterns are useful, which you want, which carry some useful information, for example, and which are harmful in that they represent like harmful biases and so on. So what usually happens is that an algorithm would learn both, right? It just like jumps on everything that correlates, and that's it, even though it might be like super racist or sexist patterns. And so safeguards here to prevent this would be to really think, to design all these algorithmic components in such a way that they prohibit this as much as possible. So, for example, if your objective is to have a system that doesn't consider the gender of a person, for example, you could formulate this as an objective and put that in a mathematical form that can be optimized, and combine it with your other business objective. So that would mean, for example, that the intermediate representation that the model learns are basically disentangled from the sensitive attributes that are also in that data somewhere. And so this is being applied in research papers, and it also works to a certain degree too, but also not perfectly. And basically what's behind, or how you can generalize this is that it really is necessary to define and operationalize your goals or the employee's interests, so that they can be also mathematically optimized. And oftentimes then you won't have like a perfect solution that can optimize like both goals, but a compromise, and then there's like maybe like a trade-off between the business objective and the employee's objective. And then of course it can be subject, for example, to negotiation, like how you basically weight these objectives against each other. All right, then you basically have your machine learning model, like just that transforms like an input into a score or something, and then you deploy it, and you do that basically. You integrate this model into a classical software that can then take a PDF as an input and put out a score or a ranking. And things that should be kept in mind here is that until now you just evaluated the model on training data. But actually this training data will be very different or kind of different to the data you will encounter in the real world. And so it's really important to note that the performance here is really an open question, and especially the performance on like different subgroups. Yeah, so it's really important to keep that in mind, that this should be monitored and tracked. Also, it's important to note that even though if the model is like perfectly fair, if you have another step in your decision-making pipeline, for example, like a human in the loop, who then like can, for example, selectively take action, this whole system can be still biased by this decision. So it's really important to also track the performance of the whole system and outcomes. Yeah, I already said it, like important safeguards here are that employees really get sufficient information on the performance of the system, also considering or referring to the performance of how well the system preserves their interests. This can, for example, also be maybe not for the individual employee, but for workers' councils or unions who basically monitor the systems. All right, then let's go to the last phase. Basically, this is the phase where you maintain the model. And I already said that the basic problem you see when you deploy the model to the real world is that the data it is trained on and the data it will experience will be diverging with time. So the model is just a snapshot of the historical data, right? And the model, the world evolves and changes, and so input data will diverge and model performance will deteriorate. And of course, this is like highly dependent on the context and the use case and how fast something changes. For example, with TikTok recommendation system, you update your model like every few seconds or every few minutes. And if you have something more static, maybe in the work context, things are generally more static, then this frequency can be a bit lower. So the remedy here is like retraining the model, and this, however, comes with other problems. Basically, two problems which I will quickly summarize. One is that the input is not only or is heavily influenced by the decision of the model itself, right? And then if you take this data and feed it back into the model through the data pipeline, then you will get like a feedback loop that will exacerbate like any small biases that are still in the model. And you can see that, for example, in recommendation engines, where the content they recommend is getting more and more homogeneous with time and retraining iterations. But for example, also like in predictive policing, where you try to predict in which quarters there will be crime, of course, you have like a self-fulfilling prophecy that then you will detect crime. And if you use then this data to retrain your model, this will get worse and worse and worse. So this is what's been described in the literature now as degenerate feedback loop. And another problem, however, is that also employees try to game, of course, the system. And going back to the CV screening example, LinkedIn, for example, has such a system in place. And there was a rumor going around. I didn't try it out, so I'm not 100% sure. But if you basically copy paste the job description into your CV, then this will get picked up by the algorithm, who basically is trying to match CVs and job descriptions, and then you can boost your score and be higher up in the ranking. And then, of course, that means that the whole system doesn't work anymore. So yeah, so there are some safeguards here also, and for example, just monitoring distributions like input and output distributions, trying to see if some features that are predictive tend to dominate over time. Also modeling the influence of the model itself is also yeah, like a measure you can take. And of course here this involves like resources in terms of like engineers having to figure these things out. It's not like you can automate these things super easily, and they may not work 100%.
Sorry to jump in, but with a look at the time, I think we should come to an end, because we have some interesting questions also in the chat, which would be great.
Yeah, I mean that was it already, that slide. So should I do the conclusions and then?
Maybe we can wrap it up really quickly, because I think what we wanted to transport today is that, you know, there are possibilities on a technical level to implement worker interests in the detail, but there are also a lot of open questions, and the questions in the chat or in the Q&A tool already allude to the very, very broad context in which this whole idea has to be implemented. So I'd say we can follow up any detailed questions also later, but there are already some questions, so I might be handing over to Aida to...
Yes, thank you, and Lukas. And maybe I would like to start with the very first question about the ways in which worker representation is much more effective. And here Frank Pot asks, which level of representation will be more effective in your opinion? Do you have a quick answer for that big question?
No, no quick answer.
Okay.
It is a very, very interesting question, and it points to the whole shift of culture, or the whole shift of understanding that is necessary, because what we've tried to do is try to demonstrate entry points on the technical level. But I think what Lukas presented, and feel free to add, is that there has to be a whole lot of negotiation on what worker interests actually are in face of ADM systems. And that's not an easy process. There are a lot of trade-offs, and Lukas has been contemplated about this quite a bit. There need to be processes to come to ideas of what worker interests could be in face of ADM systems. And in order to be able to do that, to have that discussion, there needs to be a lot more awareness on the shop floor level as well. And then we also need to have experts for the technical.
So, Anne, I would like to link this answer to the first question. Do you think that transparency is then the first demand that shop stewards or workers in the shop floor need to make in the increased phase of the algorithm?
I don't really want to prioritize, but it is essential, of course, because without transparency, without knowledge of what might be going wrong or how a system operates, it's hard to find entry points. But we also need a lot of other aspects. So I'm a bit hesitant to say that it's the first demand, but it is an essential demand, yes.
And how can you translate transparency? I mean, how would worker representative ask for transparency? Excuse me, manager, can you be more transparent? How could that look like in a practical way?
Yeah, so there are different ways. So it also depends kind of the context, but it could also only be about, what's the training data? Have there been specific quality standards applied to the training data? Lukas, you know more about Google model cards, for example. There are ways of providing information for trained models that make sure that they have been trained for one context, and these information on the performance of these models can be used to ensure that they can also be used in a different context, or have assessments being made about their use in different contexts, so that you have an idea if they're really applicable to the context that you would like to use them in. So that's my idea for transparency. Lukas, I don't know if you have additions on that.
I mean, not really. I think this is the really hard question, like how to really create transparency. But yeah, I mean, like from a technical standpoint, it's really possible. It's just like the question, like how will it really work, and do employees have the political power to really ask for this?
I think so. I think that they do have. And with that, I would also like to link to another question by Christopher Afar on bias, a favorite of ours, I suppose. And he says that in recruitment processes, it's been argued that bias can be an issue in the case of artificial intelligence or decision-making systems. Is the traditional selection process not biased as well? And he asks another question: can there be requirements that specifically identify biases that should not feature anywhere else in a system? And should such systems and that model data be open source for unions as watchdogs to evaluate? I think this is a great question. Do you guys have an answer to that?
Well, on the first part, yes, of course, also non-ADM selection processes can be biased, but in ADM systems, we have a scale, and we have in transparency for bias in different processes. We might have safeguards established. So we need to come. We are not against ADM systems. We are not techno-dystopian, but we want to have these safeguards applied because these systems have been known to have severe bias. So we just want to have this kind of safety net. So as a quick answer to that. I'm just trying to make a sense of the second part of the question.
Do you think that unions could be a sort of a watchdog body in the workplaces, or safety representatives, workers representatives could be a kind of a watchdogs in order to evaluate perhaps that the systems and the models are open source and free of bias?
I don't think open source will suffice. I don't also think it is always necessary. Of course, it's good to have transparency, but looking at the code will not necessarily help you in here, because a lot is also about the organizational implementation of these systems. So how are these systems used in an organization? That is essential. So yes, it might make sense to have open source, but it's not the answer to everything. And yes, unions and worker representatives need to be empowered to be able to become the sort of, it doesn't also have to be watchdog, but it could be co-negotiators when these systems are being implemented and used, and when they're being planned. This is what we try to show. We have the machine learning pipeline, and we need worker representatives involved along the way, because once these systems are in use, you can only be a watchdog, but you can also shape these systems according to your interests, right?
Right. And very quickly, Anne and Lukas, another question about AI ethics committees. I have a personal opinion on that, but I would like to know your point of view, and Virginia as well. And what she asked is that ethics committees oversee the adoption and the use of AI systems. In your research, have you seen that this is a widespread or perhaps a new practice to have in companies?
Well, I don't have a informed info on this, so we haven't done research. But from our experience, and we have been also working with work councils in Germany, it is not that widespread. We see some union responses, and we see some empowerment measurements or tools or instruments being provided, and we did the same thing for a work council in a German company. But it's not on a large scale, I would say, just from my feeling and my experience, but it's not empirically proven, I have to say that.
Right, thank you, Anne. And let's take just the last question. Well, there is a comment about the International Standardization Organization drafting standards on transparency measures. Well, that might be another subject of discussion. And I don't think I see another one. Please help me, you guys, if you see another question that we should address in the very last minute.
I just want to pick up one point, because here someone says that it's not easy to oblige managers to be more transparent and accountable for ADM. Well, our experience shows they often don't know, they cannot be transparent because they don't have the information. So that's a huge issue. So if you have an external ADM systems being employed internally, we need to make sure that also the company implementing this technology actually has the information available, because often, it's trade secrets and they don't get the information. So it's even more complex than that.
Right, I think that the whole message is that there is enough information, that in the whole steps of the machine learning pipeline, there is opportunities for worker involvement, for empowerment, for capacity building. There are both levels, technical, not technical, on the information and representation, data protection is involved, etc., etc. Is there another last question from the audience that would like to take? You have 1 minute to write it on the chat or the Q&A. Now that we have Anne and Lukas here with us, I think that we should take advantage of that. So your very last recommendation, Anne and Lukas, to close this very interesting presentation, what is, in a nutshell, your message to the audience that is here with us?
Well, I think we tried to demonstrate the technical part of it, but also I hope it came across that it doesn't suffice to have this technical expertise and this technical knowledge, but it is about really a change of understanding how to deal with ADM systems. And it's a lot more about organizational processes as well. But we need to have that insight that we can change the technology. And then we have to really start this whole process of awareness and negotiation on ADM in a workplace.
Lukas, final words from your side?
Yeah, I completely agree with Anne. And I think the assumption just should be that all arbitrary interests of employees can technically, in theory, be implemented, and that this should first be the assumption, and then you can go from there also. But yeah, it's not a big problem often, I would say.
Fantastic. And this brings us to the end of today's webinar. A hearty thanks to our guests, Anne Mollen and Lukas Hondrich, for being with us. And of course to you, our audience, and to my colleague Maria Nikolova. We hope that you found today's webinar interesting. Thank you for tuning into our AI Talks at ETUI. See you next time. Goodbye.